What's going on YouTube? Metal Complex here, and today I got another interesting knife review slash knife overview for you today of the C.K.F. Sukhoi, I think it's Sukhoi, if I'm not mistaken, from what I can gather. 4.0. Just a bit of disclaimer there with the pronunciation. I don't speak Russian. I'm not Russian myself. I wasn't born in Russia. It doesn't say Russian on my birth certificate. My mother isn't Russian. I didn't grow up in Russia. I didn't go to school in Russia. I don't eat Russian food necessarily. And so I'm going off an educated guess with my pronunciation, but feel free to aggressively ignore that in the comments down below since I know that's going to happen anyway. Thanks so much to my generous patrons. You can see a link to my Patreon down below. It is because of my patrons that I'm able to bring you knife content every single day, 17 times a day. I have over 10 million uploads on my channel, from inexpensive to expensive knives. I have a video for everybody, and if you look in the description below, you can also see a link to my Amazon store where you can buy everything from Metal Complex pillows to Metal Complex pacifiers to Metal Complex replacements for your wife, because honestly, who needs a wife when you have my videos? Anyway, okay, I'm done, I promise. Hi, so here I am today with a, like I mentioned earlier, a Sukhoi 4.0. I said to myself I'd never be making another knife review again. I mean, honestly, I don't have any reason to, but I feel so strongly about this knife that I have to make this review before spoiler alert, I'm not keeping it, before it goes back. There's a lot I have to say about this knife. I had a lot of anticipation for this knife, a lot of excitement leading up to me receiving this knife. And so, again, I felt really strongly about it. I thought I'd make a video about it just because why not? Just to give some context, I did have the 3.0 in the past. I'm going to be doing a lot of that swallowing thing, by the way. I even have a water bottle. Imagine that, so I can actually stay hydrated during the video. I had a 3.0 in the past. In fact, I had a few of them. I sent one back to, I want to say Knife Center, because I had some fit and finish issues. But I got another one in the secondary for about $400. And at that price point, I was pretty happy with it. I'm not going to lie. I thought the action was really great at the time. I thought the build quality and the fit and finish was sufficient. I liked the materials that were being used. I really liked the overall profile and design. I thought it was really elegant. And so even though I ended up letting it go, just because it didn't have a place in my collection at the time, I've thought about it from time to time, and I thought to myself, if another version ever gets released, I'm definitely going to pick it up. And so that's why this one's here. Just to give you a bit more context, or I guess background info or lead-in info as to how this review is going to be conducted. So this is totally freeform. It's off the top of my head. I have no notes whatsoever. And also, I'm not going to be playing with the knife much. Most of the video is just going to be the knife sitting here. I'm going to point to stuff probably, but that's pretty much it. I feel no need to sit here and play with the knife while I'm talking about it. And this is going to be a really lengthy video. It's going to be pretty details heavy, and it's going to be all super arbitrary because this is just my impression of the knife, what I like and I don't like. If you've ever seen Knife Nerdery's videos, expect a video of similar length and style. I really like Kevin's videos. I believe that's his name. And so I have no problem emulating his style, but just keep in mind that I have a lot to say about this knife. And for the price point, especially, I think it's a given that it's going to be talked about at such length. When you're talking about knives, it's expensive. Us collectors, we really care about the details. So without further ado, I'm just going to go from the tip to the butt. We're just going to talk about this knife, talk about, again, what I like and don't like, etc. Let's get into it. So first, let's talk about the blade. I have a couple opinions. Like, I go back and forth on this blade, because on a surface level, I really, really like this blade. I really like the blade shape. That's something that carried over from the original, I guess, the 3.0, as well as the other Sukhoi knives. I really like the blade shape, as well as how it fits in with the overall silhouette of the knife. It is Bowler M398, which is cool on some level. We're going to talk about that more in a second. And it has opening apertures, so if you do care to open the knife, not using this aspirated flipper tab, you can also put your finger in these aspirations over here if you want to flick it open. Yeah, it has some opening holes. It has one opening hole that is bisected, but first, as far as the finish goes, this has that high-end, quote-unquote, kind of vapory, blasted-y, semi-reflective, very fine-grain reflective finish that a lot of people like to liken to really expensive knives for some reason. The finish is very consistent and even. I like how it looks. On the flat, you can see that it has a hand rub, from what I can tell. As far as the edge goes, just basic stuff. Edge, super consistent, didn't have any problems with that. It's super sharp from the factory, that's fine. Plunge is mostly well executed. We will talk about what happened there. And all the edges are chamfered. It also has some jimping up top, and we'll talk about that too. Please keep in mind too, I'm gonna do my best to go like from front to back as far as the knife goes, but I might jump around a bit just to talk about various things because there are certain design elements that are scattered throughout the knife that merit talking about together, even if they're not necessarily next to each other on the anatomy of on the knife itself. So anyway, I'm gonna strictly talk about what I like first. So finish, really nice. Blade shape, really nice. Like all the chamfers everywhere. The opening hole is chamfered nicely. Spine is chamfered nicely. As you can see, there's a very tasteful swedge running from about here to the rest of the blade. So I think that is exactly 81.73%, if I'm not mistaken. So just keep that in mind. If you're really a ratios guy, just remember that is the number we're working with on the entirety of the knife. Okay, I'm done. Plunge, like I said, is well executed, and overall, I like the blade shape on a surface level, but there's some stuff to talk about. So first, I mentioned the jimping earlier. This jimping is, well, let me back up. Jimping, like Kevin over at Knife Nerdery likes to say, should be two things. It should be shallow and it should be sharp. It shouldn't hurt to use it, but it should be nice and grippy. It shouldn't, I mean, if you want to put jimping on a knife, make it functional, or at the very least, make it inoffensive. And that is what C.K.F did here. It is not functional, but it is inoffensive. Now, I can give them a bit of a pass because this isn't a knife you're going to be doing much use with for the majority of people, from what I can tell. They basically just buy these, play with them on their sofa, and put them in their knife case, just like I did too. But nevertheless, the jimping, while it's basically completely functionless, I mean, it gives you the slightest amount of traction and grip. You can see I'm putting pressure on the spine right now. It's not doing anything. It's just, you feel the texture there and that's it. So the jimping is basically borderline non-functional, but at least it's inoffensive. So whatever, I can give a pass there. Next, let's talk about the opening hole. Now this is going to kind of touch on the overall design a bit, because when you're paying $655 for a knife, you better have a good reason to be paying that much. You must either really love the design, or must be doing something incredible from a functional perspective or a machining perspective, or what have you. I bought this knife because I like the design and I thought the action would be great. And you know, when you're buying knives from C.K.F and you're buying knives at this price point, you come in with certain expectations. The opening hole functionally works very well. So when you open the knife, I'm going to try keeping everything in frame. You're obviously, to get more leverage, you're going to come down here. Opens up super easily. In fact, you don't even have to put that much pressure, so I'm not really putting much here, and it opens up because the pivot is pretty smooth. So the opening hole from a functional perspective, at least for reverse flicking works well. You can't really thumb flick at all. As you can see, I'm failing to do it repeatedly, so this is exclusively for reverse flicking. Now, there's a couple things I don't like about this opening hole from a design perspective. First, this opening hole doesn't necessarily flow well with the overall design, and it is because of this line right here. As you can see, it's very clear when you look at this knife initially. I mean, if you just look at the silhouette as well as the lines, everything is very curvy and flowy. There's a certain design aesthetic that runs throughout the entirety of this knife. There aren't a ton of straight lines or hard edges. So we've got this line up top that flows very smoothly over the top of the knife. And even here, the curves in the handle, the curves in the inlays, the curves in the milling that kind of frames the inlays. The Sukhoi has always struck me as a very elegant, very organic design. I think somebody once talked about it looking kind of like a baleen whale. And for whatever reason, that made a lot of sense to me at the time. So again, we're looking at a lot of curves here. We're looking at flow. It flows well. I don't have to keep talking about it because I'm starting to sound pretentious, if I don't already sound pretentious already. The point being, this line right here just doesn't work well with design. That should have been an angled line, to be frank. It's from a functional perspective. If you put your finger here, you're not even going near there. So that entire portion of the opening hole right here is purely aesthetic, just from how you're going to operate the knife. So that should have been an angled line. And then second, now I'm not sure why exactly this pillar is here, or this portion that bisects the hole. There could be a functional reason for that from a structural standpoint. Oh, we put that there so the knife is, I don't know, less likely to crack below the opening hole. And yeah, I'm just going to call it the opening hole. Sorry, I know that's I'm starting to realize how weird that sounds, but the point being, the hole. I'm not sure if it serves a structural purpose for stability or to prevent cracking, or what have you. If it's easier to mill it that way, I'm not sure, but I can tell you that it is very uninspired. It reminds me of Koenig and TJ Schwartz's designs, the Torrent as well. And it reminds me, I'm pretty sure the new Shear 111 does something similar. I don't know why they keep doing this with all of these high-end knives. I'd say all of them, but the few high-end knives that emulate this motif are doing it in the same exact way. And I wish this had honestly, a more interesting design implementation for that portion. So maybe if this portion ran from this corner here down to the bottom right corner, and maybe tried to float with the overall design, it doesn't really get in the way at all when you're flicking. And so, I mean, if we were to close it up, let's see if that actually stands up. So if we were to flick here, I'm putting this is the leverage point right here. So maybe they could have done something running from this bottom corner on the right side, or this corner here up to this top left corner. Who knows? Who knows? The point being, I'm not a design boy, all right? We're all design boys here today, but I am a critic, right? I am a purchaser, I'm a consumer. And so I wish it was a more interesting opening hole. I do like how it is somewhat echoed in the flipper tab, so that's nice, right? If you look at, again, TJ Schwartz's designs or Koenig's, if you look at the areas, something similar happens. So we've got a milling pattern or holes that are kind of echoed throughout the course of the knife itself on different parts of the knife. So I can give them some points there. Honestly, I could take or leave the whole hole in the flipper tab, but it's there, so cool. Whatever, they did it. Next, the blade steel, M398. Now, this is purely theoretical. This is purely from just an appraisal of the knife market right now. I'm not really seeing M398 in a lot of knives. I'm pretty sure I saw it on an exclusive KNP variant of one of Brian Nadeau's knives, but I haven't really seen it much else. And so this, again, it doesn't really matter for two reasons. One, I mean, it's theoretical, it's hypothetical. I haven't tested this. And then two, even if I were to test it, most people aren't going to be using their knives for much anyway. At least knives of this price point, this kind of knife. There's the minority that actually uses their knife, this particular kind of knife, a large, quote unquote, like designer knife, a high-end, super high-end production knife, is just that. They are a minority. Most people are just playing with their knives. So hell, I mean, M390 would have been fine. I mean, you know, at CBM 20CV, which is basically the same thing. So whatever. An analog, as us in the knife review game like to say. You could have put anything, honestly, that was mid-range or higher. You could have put RWL 34, and I'm sure people would have lapped this thing up. The point being, they used M398. I'm not really sure how the heat treat is done. I'm not really sure even if I care. So I'm bringing it up so you know, and that is it. Now, moving back, we're going to touch on the action a little bit, and unfortunately, because of the way I'm conducting this review, we're going to have to since I'm going from front to back. But let's get into it right now. Let's get into the action. So we've talked about the blade. I think we've talked about it enough. The reason I bring up the action is because we're about to talk about this flipper tab. This flipper tab is bad. It's just bad. And I'm going to talk about why, because it's not inherently bad. It is bad because of the execution of this action. And this action is exactly the kind of action I do not like. I do not like this action at all, and I'm going to tell you why. So first, why is this flipper tab not necessarily bad? Well, it gives you decent leverage. So let's say in an ideal world, where this flipper tab was mated well with the detent strength and the action here, this would give you enough leverage while being low profile enough and tasteful enough in its design. So inoffensive is a better way to put it, that it wouldn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't really make me feel any kind of way other than having the milling here and inside of the tab itself, which again kind of echoes the opening hole here. So cool, whatever. But as far as the actual design of the tab goes, from a silhouette perspective, from like the physical design of the tab itself, it's fine. I mean, it doesn't hurt or anything like that. It's fine. But there are elements that make this flipper tab suck to use. First of all, and this is getting more into the rest of the action, the detent on this knife is hard. I'm going to use this flipper. I'm going to attempt to open it just using the flipper tab, and I'm going to open it normally. As you can see, as you can hear, yes, while this opens with authority, the detent on this knife is too hard. It just is. It does the same thing that the Gen 4 Arius does, which I am not a fan of at all. The detent is so hard that, sure, the first time you open it, it's impressive. Oh, wow, it really cracks open. Then you open it another time, and you realize, wow, the detent is really hard, and it sucks to use with anything other than the opening hole. Honestly, I mean, either they should have dialed the detent down, or they should have just they should have just cut this off entirely and just made this an exclusive reverse slick knife. Plain and simple. The jimping on this right here is it's the same kind of jimping that's over here as well. So in other words, it's completely useless. It doesn't do anything. And the moment your fingers start to get sweaty, forget about using the slipper tab unless you're coming at it from the side like this. If you, I mean, this is something I do with a lot of knives. If you come at it from the side, it's easier to use it, but it still isn't fun to use. It just isn't. The detent is too hard for a flipper tab of this size and shape. Couple that with the jimping, and it is borderline useless at times. Or it goes from being, sufficient at times in an ideal world environment where your fingers are dry and your fingers aren't fatigued from opening this knife, to being completely borderline unusable and extremely unpleasant to use. So thoughts on the flipper tab. Next, the detent that I already mentioned. The detent is too hard for the flipper tab. I think the detent is perfect. Well, I failed at that time, but the detent is perfect. I'm just trying to show how little force it needs from this angle for reverse flicking. In fact, this is one of the best reverse flick knives I've ever had. That isn't really saying much because people will get the PM2 and say the same thing. So, but nevertheless, it's a great reverse flick knife. It's really satisfying. This has a chunky, like thick opening sound. Here, it's not going to get captured well. I can tell you right off the bat. I'm just using my phone's mic, but it has this, again, a slight resonance to it. You can hear that because of the way that this is like constructed, right? Different materials. It's not like there's no high-end ting or there's no mechanical clang. It's kind of like a chunky composite thud, but it's not just a thud, it's like a shook. So it sounds nice. And then on the close, it doesn't sound mechanical at all, which could be kind of off-putting to some. I feel like some cheaper, like more budgety knives have a similar sound when they close, which is just, it's like the sound of composite material again, like G10 or FRN or something kind of being struck lightly by some force. But the point being, and since acoustics are part of the action too, the point being, when you reverse flick this, it's very satisfying. And in terms of the acoustic themselves, while they aren't amazing or they don't particularly stand out, the opening sound, the deployment sound is nice. It's nice to listen to. It's not bad at all. The closing sound is whatever. Take it or leave it. It's pretty uninspired. However, we're going to touch on the last part of why I don't like detents like this, or at least the way they implemented this detent. First, this has quote-unquote lash. It's pretty minor, but I get really nitpicky at this price point. When you start to open this knife, because of the detent strength, this knife will open up enough before it actually flies open that you can totally see the tip coming out, and you can feel it too. You can feel it. It's like coming out by at least a millimeter or two, I would say. Honestly, does that really matter much? Not necessarily, but this is also a big knife. And so depending on how you're holding this knife to open it and this and that, having that tip come out, and couple that with how slippery this flipper tab can get, that tip might actually slip into your hand at some point. Again, theoretical, so maybe it doesn't matter to you at all, but it matters to me, especially at this price point. And we're going to talk, that's going to keep coming up during the course of this review. This is a $655 knife. However, the last part about this I really don't like is closing this knife. Simply put, the lock bar strength is way too high. It just is. I can see how some people would like that to some degree, and I like a lock bar that is stiffer than the alternative. I don't like a super floppy or easy to disengage lock bar necessarily because it starts to feel unsafe at that point. But this lock bar takes a lot of force to actually disengage, to the point where I find myself actually flexing muscles in my forearm to close disengage this lock bar at times. Couple that with the fact that this doesn't have a detent ramp, and this knife very quickly, if you're at least using your thumb, gets annoying to close. I found myself coming over and using my pointer finger to close it instead, which every time I notice myself doing that, I know it's because I'm compensating for lock bar pressure that is too high, or it's designed in such a way to make it not necessarily super comfortable to disengage. I feel like just from a design perspective, having these scallops here, yeah, this could be a fine knife to disengage. There have been plenty of knives that use a similar implementation for relief cuts in order to disengage the lock bar, and so in that way it could have been fine. But the tension's just too high. It's just too high. There's no other way to put it. It doesn't need to be this high, and it's frustrating, especially at this price point. Now, let's move away from the action for a second. Oh, well, we should talk about the pivot too. So this uses MRBS. It says it inside. There's a milled portion that says MRBS with a little logo next to it, which is cute. So this does have MRBS. It uses kind of that Mickey Mouse bearing pattern, where it's almost a triangular shape. It's running around the course of the washer itself. And there's a bunch of bearings. They're super small. But in terms of from a friction perspective, a perceived friction perspective, this is quite smooth. It is very smooth. That is one of the best parts about this action, in fact. It is very, very smooth. You can hear it. If you listen close, you can certainly hear it. But it's silky is one way to describe it. It isn't silky per se because you still feel just a touch of friction. But I think the action itself, I think the action could be appropriate for the price point. If everything else is executed well, yeah, the action in terms of how the pivot operates, I'm fine with it, especially with how the knife is finished. I'm sure in the pivot area, it lends itself to a very pleasant, in terms of the actual, how you perceive the friction of the pivot, it leads to a very pleasant experience. The closing action is not a guillotine, which I'm actually a fan of. I think guillotine actions are overrated. Again, I put a much higher emphasis on smoothness. This just takes a couple gentle cocks of the wrist, a couple gentle shakes in order to close it, and then it's fine. So the pivot, honestly, and how the MRBS is implemented, is probably my favorite part about this, about the entire action itself, other than the reverse flick action. So tab, annoying, lock bar, annoying, disengage. So we got some good, got some bad. Moving backwards, we're going to be talking more about design now and implementation of the materials here and the fit and finish, because that is a bone I have to pick with this knife. So first, we have, I believe, I should have just read the COA, but this is Mokutai, if I'm not mistaken, along with Mokutai on the clip, mentioning that because they're the same material. So I'm of two minds of this. I look at it and go, oh, that's cool. It's Mokutai. And I didn't clean it before this review was conducted, because I think most people aren't going to sit around cleaning their Mokutai every time. It's better to see how it's going to look after you handle it, because at least I know myself, I'm not going to sit here and clean it every time I pick up this knife so I can ogle it and how brilliant, quote unquote, it looks when it's new. I look at it, and for the first few seconds I say, wow, it's nice. And then I say, I wish they hadn't put it there so I could have saved an extra $100, $150. We're going to talk about this later, but yes, the pivot collar, it's executed well, it's milled nicely, and it's cute on some level that they included these higher end materials to justify a higher price point, but that's exactly what they did. They included higher end materials to justify a higher price point. And I'm not a fan of that. I really am not. I don't like when companies do that, and companies very rarely do that. This is one of the only instances that I've seen this, but the point being, I wish this was just a titanium pivot collar like the last time. I thought it was really handsome last time, and I don't think that this necessarily lends anything in other than maybe just higher perceived value. It lends nothing to the overall design, just because you could say, hey, yeah, the contrast is really nice, right? So you have gray and black, and you have gray over here. So, oh, Aman, of course it lends to the overall design. You have a pop of color here, a pop of color here. Yeah, but Mokutai gets really washed out after you handle it. Unless you have it in perfect lighting and unless it's clean, it ends up looking kind of dingy, which you could say matches the overall design because of the stonewash. The stonewash is really nice, actually. I'm not trying to knock it, but the point being, it doesn't look great after you handle it. This is just a virtue of Mokutai, so it's like, have you ever handled Mokutai? I get it, but the point being, I wish this just wasn't there. I would have taken a nicely anodized titanium clip and pivot collar setup instead for a cheaper price point. Moving on, the pivot itself, I'm pretty sure everything is T8. Wow, you should have checked that before you did the review. I don't really care. That sounded kind of abrasive. I don't really care, just because I'm pretty sure it's all T8 all around, which is great. T8 all around. Thank you, knife companies, as Metal Complex likes to say. Yeah, T8 is great. I'm happy with this being T8. It is keyed on both sides, and from what I can tell in the extra hardware, which they do include, so just as an aside, they do include extra hardware, and they include an extra pivot barrel with 2 extra pivot screws for the entirety of the body, as well as an extra lock bar insert, which is really great. They don't include an extra clip like they would normally, which I can understand, right? It's Mokutai. And they didn't include extra carbon fiber because these inserts are all glued in, so I get that you can't swap them in. But the actual pivot, like the hardware itself, in terms of it, like the torques and whatnot, the torque size you need to use, it's all T8, so that's good. It's keyed on both sides, which is annoying, but if you have two Torx tools or 2 screwdrivers, you should be okay. So we've talked about the pivot enough. Just as also a quick fit and finish note, and I'm going to be touching on every little fit and finish file I find because, well, that matters at this price point. There's a mark here on the pivot. It might be hard to see, and I can't really look at my camera because I have just as an aside, looking at my screen really hurts my eyes at the moment. But if you can see it, there's a mark on the pivot, which $655, kind of annoying. And so, yeah, the pivot itself, in terms of a design perspective, all right, I could take or leave the Mokutai. In terms of these carbon fiber inlays, since we have one running around the pivot, let's just talk about them now. I am of two minds about this as well. So, one, I really like that they went the quote-unquote extra mile this time with attempting to inlay carbon fiber in multiple areas around the knife, right, in a way that doesn't necessarily clash with the design. And this is something I'm going to talk about in a few moments, or in a minute, the overall design and how it kind of these different design elements integrate or don't integrate with the overall design. But I like that they tried to do something that is more difficult than last time, right? So last time the inlays were screwed in and you had a large inlay on both sides. This time we have multiple inlays on both sides, one here, one here. We have one on the lock bar, and then we have another over here on the lock bar, and then we have the one surrounding the pivot. So on one hand, I like that they tried to do this. This does feel kind of high-end in a way, right? So well-executed inlays that are flush, that are done well, can make a knife can justify, can merit a higher price point, and I get that. And the way these inlays are executed too, there's a lot of good here. I'm not going to sit here and say that they did a bad job necessarily. They all the inlays, while they aren't flush, they run a very consistent chamfer around all of the inlays. And also, if you see a shadow moving around, I'm not sure if you can. I have my phone covered up with a cloth, and I have to just keep checking to make sure I'm in frame. There is a chamfer running around the edges of all these inlays, which is nice. So you have chamfers running around, and they're consistent too, which is nice. So they put some effort in there, and they also put as far as the milling goes, they did this angled line milling on the entirety of the carbon fiber, on all the carbon fiber that's on this knife, which is nice. So it gives it nice texture, right? It feels pleasant to the touch. You don't necessarily need more texture or gription or what have you when it comes to this knife design, just because the way you hold it and the way it feels in your hand, you don't necessarily need it, but it feels really nice from a tactile perspective. It feels nice. You have these different surfaces, and they feel different. They're all pleasantly like knocked down. They're not sharp or abrasive or anything. That's nice. However, and there's always, I feel like this is a common theme with this knife. However, these inlays aren't perfectly executed, which is frustrating. I can understand that, again, on a $400 knife. The complexity of these inlays and the work that's put into them, I can take or leave some fit and finish issues that are small. I get it. Okay. For a $500 knife, it starts to become a little more egregious, but whatever. You really like the design, that's fine. For a $600 knife, okay, I'm really not liking that. $655, I feel like I like it even less. Two things that were wrong with these carbon fiber inlays. One, they just missed the milling here entirely. I can run my finger over this little chunk that sticks out here, and it should be a millimeter or two shorter. It's basically just sticking out. It's hard to show it on camera, but it's just sticking out, and it shouldn't be there. It just shouldn't be there. If I was keeping this knife, I would want to sand it down or something. They just didn't mill it down all the way. Second off, and this is kind of hard to show on camera too, and I apologize for that, but where these inlays are mounted up here, there's actually a tiny bit of glue that ended up collecting here. As I ran my finger over it, I noticed a weird kind of sensation running my finger over it. Like, is my finger sticking a little bit? And yeah, there was a little bit of leftover glue, like residue from the factory right up here and here on either inlay, which is just, again, if it's too complex or you can't meet the fit and finish like watermark or goals of a $655 knife, lower the price. But anyway, so I'm of two minds of the carbon fiber. I really want to like it, and it's like they got so close to it being perfect, but then they just always tend to stumble at the last mile. And that is, again, a theme that I find with the entirety of this knife. So whatever, starting to lose some steam. How long is this already? 28 minutes. I hope someone is still watching this. Oh, man. Also, water break. Forgive me. I got to. Okay. Now let's talk about these inlays from a design perspective. So we're going to talk about the overall knife as well. Now, from a design perspective, at least, while these inlays, while the overall design, I will say, I think the overall design is a win. I think you could say a triumph or whatever. I think it's very pleasant to look at, and I think a lot of the design coheres well or meshes together well. It's very cohesive, right? So you have this blade, which is, again, it's a very classic drop point, but it's very elegant, right? You have this handle that curves in such a way here and here. You have a little bit of fine jimping here, and you have some texturing on the backspacer as well. You have the clip, which kind of echoes. It's almost like they took the blade and turned it over in some way, right? So it's got nice curves here too, and even the way the lock bar is cut, you have these nice curves. You have the way that the handle is milled. So the construction of this, by the way, you have titanium overlays. You can see from the screws here, these are titanium overlays. Then you have the carbon fiber that's glued into those overlays. Then you have titanium liners, quote unquote. I mean, pseudo liners. I mean, this is still a frame lock, so however you want to interpret that. Then you have a zirconium back here. The way that these inlays are implemented from a design perspective, I think, while Malyshev, right, Tohus, Anton Malyshev, the designer, I think he pushed the design a little bit in terms of the overall like how it all meshes together. Just because you have almost, you could say, like futuristic design motifs with how these inlays are milled right in the lines and this and that. And again, I'm not a designer or whatever, but while he does add a little bit of flair, or there's a bit of discord with these elements, I think I'm just going to stop trying to sound so pretentious. I think the overall design works well. I'll just say that. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and I think, at least in my eyes, that this is still a very elegant and well done design. So anyway, we're done talking about the carbon fiber inlays. I've said my piece about them. Like I said, we've got them over here too, but I can't say anything about these inlays. They haven't said about the inlays in general already. Moving on, we do have screws here. I could take or leave those. I think they break up the design a bit, seeing 2 screws here, 2 screws here. But honestly, the way this knife is constructed, I don't really see how else they could have gone about it. That wouldn't have been more complex. Like I said, this is like a sandwich with a sandwich around it. So, okay, I get it. The screws are there. They do stick up a little bit, so these aren't flush screws. Again, I'm going to have a tough time showing this on camera, so I'm just going to leave this here. The screws, if you run your nail here, they're flush at the top, but because of the way that this is milled out, the other face or the other side of the screws, they stick out a little bit. Honestly, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. It would have been nice if they were flush, but oh boy, I'm sure that would have been more difficult to implement. So, okay, I get it. Let's move on to the backspacer, because actually the backspacer is one of the only areas of the knife that I just don't have a problem with. I really like it. So first, it is zirconium like the last time, but what I like most is that it's not polished. It is matte. And I mean, it's going to show less wear, which is the best part about having a matte backspacer like this. It's still Zirc, which is cool. Like, oh, it's Zirc. I have Zirc on my knife. That makes it more expensive. That means it's like this cool material that isn't titanium. And then you look at it, you handle it, and it's like, yep, it feels like titanium, but I still like it, right? I like the fact that there are different materials on this knife. I like how they finished it. It's very matte. It's very well done. The jimps, or I guess the texturing back here, we have 5 lines here, here, here. So every section of milling here is 5 lines altogether, which isn't really echoed in the rest of the knife, but whatever. And so you can see there's a lanyard loop back here. It's kind of similar to Shiro's, if I'm not mistaken. If I recall correctly, I haven't had a Shiro in a while, but it's not offensive. It's all the edges are broken down nicely. It's not uncomfortable in the hand. You would think it could be because of how a knife sits in your hand when you try to deploy it like this, but honestly, it doesn't feel bad at all. It's well chamfered, and there aren't sharp corners, and it's wide enough and it's low profile enough that it doesn't matter. So this is one of the very few times that I just don't care about the lanyard hole that much. Also, because if you look at it in a certain way, the way the lanyard hole is implemented here actually kind of fits in with the flipper tab hole, which kind of fits in with the opening hole in the blade. So it's like, cool. There's some design cohesion there. And you're going to hear me say this a lot. From a design perspective, I'm a fan of this knife. I am, truly. I think there are some things that are done really well here. So that's the backspacer. Moving on, we have the clip. Clip is totally fine. From a functional perspective, it has enough spring, it has enough ramp. I'm not going to be able to show it well, just trust me on that. The biggest problem I have with this clip is what I mentioned earlier with the pivot collars. This just shouldn't have been Mokutai. I don't want this to be Mokutai. Make it titanium, bring the price down again. We're going to talk about why I feel that way in a little bit, but in terms of the overall silhouette, fits nicely with the design, has nice curves, it flows well. There's even a little bit of milling right here to add a little bit of complexity, so that's fine. It is mounted from the outside, which I honestly, take it or leave it, it's fine with me. It could have been mounted internally, but I think you could make an argument that the overall complexity of the build already, it makes up for the fact that this has 1 extra screw showing on this side. So, okay, it's fine. And I mean, again, coupled with the lock bar inlays and this and that, there is some effort that was put in here for this design and for the build here. So I'm fine with the screw here. I'm just not fine with the materials used. I'll touch on this real quick. Ergonomics are totally fine. I mean, I hold this knife and the only quote-unquote hot spot is the clip, and it's one of those hot spots that you feel, but it isn't necessarily uncomfortable until you really bear down on it for a significant period of time. You feel the clip when you're holding it, but I think the way in which this knife is going to be used, and again, when people are collecting knives like this, they're not really going to be using them for much. I think the ergonomics they're totally fine. One area that they did well was right here where the lock bar is cut. Either there seems to be a very slight chamfer, and because the cut seems to be done at a downward angle, it's not offensive. Even if I run my fingers on it over at oblique angles, it doesn't hurt. It's not uncomfortable. Right here could be a problem area, and it is for a lot of knives, having that little point where the lock bar is cut away. It's not uncomfortable at all. Truly, I can say that without any reservation, really. If I sit here and really think about it after a significant period of time, you might start to feel it, but I have no problems with it. So now we're going to start touching on stuff that is less about, I guess, specific aspects of the knife and more about the overall knife itself, and then C.K.F itself too. So just a bit of a disclaimer. I mean, again, I bought this knife on my own. I don't intend to make more reviews. I don't really care how my opinion is perceived by a knife company or the rest of the whoever. I mean, I'm not trying to say like, oh man, I'm trying to be a contrarian or intentionally abrasive. I'm just trying to say that I'm giving my honest and sincere thoughts as somebody who was a fan of the previous design at the previous price point, and am now dealing with a knife that is an iteration of that design at a much higher price point. I believe the last Sukhoi, the 3.0, retailed at close to 500, which again, I felt pretty okay with, but now I don't feel okay with it, and I'm going to talk about why. So first, the fit and finish of this knife is not worth $655. It just isn't. I have my own theories as to where C.K.F knives are manufactured, who manufactures them. Obviously, nobody really likes to talk about this at all, but the vast majority of the machining and everything is done in China. It's not done in Russia or anything like that. My understanding is that recently C.K.F moved their factory elsewhere to a Russia-adjacent country, and so there's a reason they can just move their factories, to be honest. These aren't manufactured there. They're manufactured in China. My understanding is that they follow the model of getting all their parts manufactured elsewhere. They bring them in-house, and then they maybe do some minor finishing, and they do the fitment and stuff like that in-house, and then off they go. C.K.F, you're welcome to comment if I'm incorrect, but this is just from what I've gathered over the years from what people say about your knives and the information I've learned myself. Number two is that I have an idea as to what factory per se manufactured these knives. And this is something that it might matter to, it might not. Everybody has a different value, value system when it comes to knives. And so my value system might be different from yours. The way I evaluate what makes a knife worth the cost is going to be different from you. You can say like, oh, and this is something I didn't even touch on. This knife has so much work, so much milling, not even externally, but also internally. I didn't even mention that. There's an incredible amount of internal milling here. And it's well finished internal milling too. So this kind of black washy, like DLC coated stonewash texture or coating, it extends to the interior of the knife, and everything seems, from what I can tell without disassembling the knife, everything is well chamfered and finished, and there are different shapes of milling inside, which is honestly like the milling over here, for example, it echoes the milling that's on the inlays to some degree. We have angled lines, kind of angled pill shapes over here, the milling over here. And then we have more square shapes over here. And you can even say like, oh yeah, like they even made some effort here with the landing pad for the flipper tab. Spoiler alert, that landing pad doesn't do anything. That your finger lands further back. So if you look at these knives, if you look at higher end knives and you just look at them from a quote unquote effort perspective, then you could think like this comes closer to meriting the price point than I think. But again, my theory from, not even my theory. I'm just going to say this with the understanding that none of this is definitive, or I'm not speaking from a place of authority or anything like that. I just know that Kevin John made they sold, I believe it was the Venom or a different. I could be wrong on the name. But a knife many years ago that was originally sold as the C.K.F de Boya, if I'm not mistaken. And over the years, as I've handled several C.K.F knives and watched reviews and this and that, I wouldn't be surprised if Kevin John is, or at least the factory behind Kevin John, or the factory conglomerate, or what have you, still manufactures their knives, plain and simple. And so that could be another consideration for you. Do you even care if the factory behind this knife, even if that is the factory that's manufacturing it, is a clone maker? Do you care about that? What's your ethical perspective? Do you care? And again, that just plays into your value system as a knife collector. But the point being, at $400 to $500, I think C.K.Fs merit their price point from an effort perspective and from who they collab with, right? So we have Anton Malashev, which he if you want his designs, you're going to have to buy C.K.F. We have the Peter Rosenti C.K.Fs that have been released, the Snafu and the Satori, right? And I believe there's one other, the name slips my mind. You have the 520 and 523, right? Which, I mean, they were like darlings of the buy it and flip it community for a while, from people who buy the next hype knife. So they have collabs. You have the Evo, right? The Evo 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and people, those knives sell out in a heartbeat. And it's funny because, right, I did some like a metal complex impression at the beginning of the video. Even he says that his Evo didn't feel like it was worth the price point. It was like a $400 to $500 knife. Oh, as a total aside, I forgot to mention this earlier. They messed up the sharpening at the heel of the blade. I totally forgot to mention that. The plunge grind extends out a little further, and so even at $655, there's still a tiny bit of a smile happening at the heel of the blade. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, it's just, we have the glue thing that happened here. We have the missed carbon fiber here. We have the overly hard lock bar to disengage, right? We have just very small fit and finish things that remind me that like, oh, this is not quite a $655 knife. And to be fair, you're welcome to say like, wow, you really care that some carbon fiber wasn't milled properly and that there's some glue here, for example. Yeah, you can make an argument there, but the lock bar thing is it's super annoying. And again, there are the Mokutai as well, which was just honestly, it did not need to be on this knife. C.K.F still is at a place, and I feel quite strongly about this, where they shouldn't be pushing their prices higher because their fit and finish does not meet a $650 price point. It just doesn't. These knives are firmly in the $400 to $500 price range for me, and they've been there for years. They just haven't gone further than that. That's just how it feels. I mean, just there's a lot of exposed hardware, for example, too, and that's kind of a priority when you get to higher price points, and it's something intangible at times too. You can pick up a knife and you feel it and you inspect how it's put together. And I've had experience. Oh, I've had experience at a variety of price points, but the couple of the hard lock bar with how hard it is to flip this knife with the flipper tab, it left a sour taste in my mouth with this knife. I think it would have been great if they released basically a true iteration of the 3.0 from an action perspective, and they kept the price at a similar well, they kept the price the same, to be frank. I would have been more okay with it. I would have been more okay with it. Honestly, this knife is still dead to me because of the lock bar thing. It's just, no. I have plenty of other knives that do the lock bar well. Oh, I completely forgot to mention this. Well, if you're still here, please forgive me for mentioning this too late. This is kind of just like an overall knife reviewer game thing that annoys me. So, then a lot of knife reviewers like to talk about this finish on the blade being a super high-end finish, right? This kind of like, this very hazy, extremely fine grain to the point where you can't even see the grains, cloudy finish that's semi-reflective that looks really luxurious. A lot of people like to say, wow, this finish, like, it's so well done, it's amazing. Yeah, it's a really nice finish that you can find on WE knives for $250 to $300. My Pleroma has it, my Eterna has it. I had a WE Bullet, which was like $225. The designer slips in mind, which is a shame because he was a very prominent designer. You can find that finish on knives that are much cheaper. Similarly, while the stonewash on the handle scales is really nice, you can find the finish on this very similar stonewash, which is well done on knives that are cheaper. It's not like the carbon fiber, while it is well milled, it's not like the pattern of the carbon fiber itself is particularly inspiring in any way. You have the milling here, which really breaks up the fact that this is marbled carbon fiber, and you can see a very minimal voids because of that. So that milling is it's a clever way to minimize the whole void issue that a lot of people have with marbled carbon fiber, myself included. But in terms of the materials used, I mean, really you can just point to the Mokutai, be like, oh, wow, you have Mokutai on there, and you have M398, which, to be frank, the cost of blade steels is the difference between them is much, much smaller than you might think. Couple that with the Mokutai, I mean, just, the Mokutai really rubs me the wrong way. I think you can pick up on that. So, what is my, verdict on this knife after talking about it for how long now? 42 minutes? What is my verdict on this knife? Well, I wish this knife was cheaper. I wish this knife was cheaper. I wish the lock bar was lighter, and I'd be more okay with the other stuff about it. I'd be more okay with who I think is manufacturing with it, or manufacturing it. I'd be more okay that it's just manufactured in China in general. There's nothing wrong with knives manufactured in China, but when you have knives coming from Rayot, which have quite frankly, immaculate finish for the most part, and in the $300 to $400 price range, for $655, this just doesn't seem worth it. Even at $400 to $500, right? It's like, okay, cool. I'm paying for MRBS, right? I'm paying for a larger knife. Okay. I'm paying because I really liked the overall silhouette and the design, right? Because you could say that this is a very understated silhouette and overall design, but on the flip side, there are a lot of knives that just don't execute it as well as the Sukhoi series does. I thought the 3.0 was a really well-designed knife. You look at it and you just think it's really elegant. I think Metal Effort was the one who said that it's a kind of knife that you could take out at a party and people would just be like, wow, it's a really elegant knife after they stop screaming because it's a 4-inch blade. Speaking of which, this is a 4.1-inch blade. It's 5.5 ounces. If you care about specs, go check NC Blade's website. So I'll be much more okay with it because, yeah, it would be like the rest of C.K.F stable where you're seeking it out because you like the design and the execution, fit and finish it stuff is good enough where if there's very small issues, right, very small fit and finish flaws, you can give them a pass because for the most part, they meet that price point and whatever leftover misgivings you have about the fit and finish can be met by the design and how it's executed in terms of the, again, just like the overall elements that appeal to you. But for $655, no. I just don't feel good about keeping this knife. Not when I have other knives that have an action, a reverse flick action that is done just as well for much cheaper. Not when I have other knives that have pleasing designs as well, like the Pleroma is a great example, to be honest, that have really gorgeous, honestly gorgeous. The Pleroma, I think, is one of the most beautiful production knife designs ever made. Rest in peace, Elijah. When you have knives meeting much lower price points that with similar fit and finish, and also that can either meet the motifs and the, I guess, the elements you're seeking out or exceed them in some ways, usually meet them. I don't think put together as a package, this knife hits $655. I've said that several times. If this was cheaper, if it was $450 to $500, I'd give it a second look, and I'd probably put more of an effort into keeping it. But right now, and this is why I spoke at such length about this knife, as much as I wanted to keep this knife and like it and have this kind of cap off my collecting for a very, very, very long time, it's not going to, and I'm not going to keep this knife. So those are my thoughts about the about the Sukhoi 4.0. Feel free to comment what you think below. I mean, I'm not going to be able to respond because of my whole eye problem thing with screens. And again, C.K.F, you're welcome to give us more information about who manufactures your knives in the comments. You're welcome to do so in your processes. I would welcome that, because nobody seems to have any idea what those processes and the origins necessarily are and which factory is doing your work. So please, if you ever stumble upon this video, you are more than welcome to share that in the comments. So that's all I have to say about it. I think I've covered everything. Honestly, even if I missed anything, I think most of you either stopped watching or you think I've spoken at length about this enough. And yeah, stay safe out there. See ya.